Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the final part of our Raising Non-dilutive Capital series. Today, we will talk about impact-linked financing, what it is, why it's useful, and how to find it as an entrepreneur. As a quick overview, impact-linked finance refers to a linking of financial rewards for market-based organizations to the achievements of positive social outcomes. It is a highly effective way of aligning positive impact with economic viability and lies at the intersection between blended finance, impact investing, and results-based finance. I'm Sebastian Molina Gasman, and I am an investment manager at SeedStars. And today we have two panelists who I will introduce shortly, who are both experts on the topic and active in connecting entrepreneurs to impact-linked financing or have, as entrepreneurs, raised this kind of capital. Before we start, you might know a bit about SeedStars, or you might not. So I wanted to quickly walk you through what we do. As a group, SeedStars can be divided into two parts. On the one hand, we have SeedStars community. This side of SeedStars is where we normally it's where we accelerate technology and startup ecosystems through third-party partnerships. What we do is support startups across their whole life cycle, from very early on, teaching potential and future entrepreneurs about how to create startups, all the way to cross-regional or cross-border expansions. We do this with a host of partnerships, and we're excited about the impact we've had so far in over 90 ecosystems. On the other side, we have SeedStars Investments. We're an early stage investor in high growth technology companies. And today, through our global seed stage fund, we have invested in 75 companies across 32 countries. Working with our portfolio companies, we have found that a lot of the startups in our portfolio can benefit from debt or other forms of non-dilutive capital. However, there are often a lot of misconceptions or questions around the process of actually obtaining this type of financing or how to access these instruments. As a result, we wanted to showcase the different types of non-dilutive capital available for startups and create a seven-part series in which we talk to experts on all different types of non-dilutive financing options. We're excited to announce that the series has been a success, and although this is our last iteration, we will have the whole record of all the different sessions available on our website, which I will share at the end of this session. Today, I'm honored to welcome two panelists who have experience in the field of impact-linked financing. First, we will chat with Ramona Liberov, lead of strategic initiatives at Roots of Impact. They're pioneers in the field of impact-linked financing and will share their insights working with a host of entrepreneurs and different organizations that provide this type of capital. Afterwards, we'll have the opportunity to talk to Greg Krupa, CEO and founder of Nobleus, who will give his point of view as an entrepreneur who has received impact-linked capital in the past. These two panelists have interacted with this type of instrument in many ways, and will provide us with their perspective on the model, as well as provide some useful information for any entrepreneur for whom this type of financing might be a good fit. With that in mind, I would like to invite Ramona to join me on the stage so she can tell us a little bit about her work at Roots of Impact. Ramona, hey, it's great to have you here.
Hey, good morning, Sebastian, and hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Great to be here.
Fantastic. As a quick overview, everyone, Ramona is the lead of strategic initiatives at Roots of Impact, where their goal is to change the finance system for funding high impact, high innovation emerging market entrepreneurs. Formerly, she was the CEO of Spring Accelerator in Africa and Asia and the CEO of the European Energy Investment Fund, in the Energy Innovation Hub. Ramona, I'm incredibly excited to have you here today with us. Could you please tell us a bit more about Roots of Impact as well as the work you're doing?
Sure, my pleasure. Roots of Impact is not an investor. We're an intermediary and change maker. And part of the reason why we do this work is because we believe there needs to be a systems change in the way that particularly social entrepreneurs in emerging markets are funded and incentivized to do their work. A lot of the funders we work with are public or philanthropic actors who say that what they want is to fund, social change or social good, but they have tended to be pretty poor at supporting private sector actors who we happen to believe, along with seed stars, are the best way of actually ensuring that these changes happen and are not dependent on development project or grants in perpetuity. Because a lot of the opportunities, like we'll hear from Greg, that are being addressed are actually market opportunities that just require some time and some funding in order to achieve the deep impact and reach that they're capable of. So the reason why we do these three linked things, obviously the core of our work, as we'll hear in a minute, is the kind of transaction structuring and design work that we do on behalf of funders. But we also do quite a lot of education work for public funders in order to explain to them that things like just grants or things like loan guarantees to draw in private investors may not actually support the high impact entrepreneurs in the way that's the most effective for them. So if I can just go to the next slide. What we realized, and this is definitely what I realized during my work on Spring and also as a founder myself, is that there are a lot of amazing enterprises and entrepreneurs that fit right into this gap, which is basically that they are not SMEs. They're high growth, innovative enterprises that have the potential for enormous scale and to support some of the critical infrastructure or infrastructural challenges like health, education, or energy that need fixing in emerging and developing markets. However, they're almost impossible to fund. Because they're in places where there isn't kind of mainstream venture capital. I mean, Seed Stars is one of the very few actors that actually operates in many of these markets. And as you know, Sebastian, it's hard sometimes to find follow-on or growth capital. But also these enterprises are too large and too commercial for the kind of support that may be available from microfinance organizations or individual investors in markets. So having recognized this gap, next slide, please. What we did at Roots of Impact is think, actually, who can help to fill this gap? And there really needs to be a new role for the critical actors of public funders and philanthropists. These are people who often kickstart markets, have the capacity, and even though they may not be the deepest pocketed people around, are often some of the only capital available in many of the markets in which we work. So the question was, what if public funders and philanthropists could be asked to work in a different way, one that is more suited to the needs of high growth social entrepreneurs? Next slide, please. So we'll hear a live example of this when Greg from Nobleus talks about how this was used for his company. But in effect, what we do is we bring together in a blended finance way a set of actors to make sure that everybody gets what they need. So in a very simplified sense, you have an outcomes payer. For example, one of our earliest pioneer organizations has been the Swiss Development Corporation, where they have goals. For example, the provision of renewable infrastructure for rural areas, or the support for female-led businesses, or the provision of high-quality services in education, let's just say. So for a recent transaction I just structured, in this case, the outcome payer would be the Swiss Development Corporation, and they have an outcome in mind. In this case, the provision of high-quality vocational education for refugees in a country in the Middle East. What's really crucial here is that this isn't just about good intentions. It's actually about performance. And it's also about establishing data and benchmarks for the sector as a whole. So the role of our verifier and verification is very, very important in all of this. So the outcome payer gets what they want is someone is actually providing performance around things like high quality education. The impact enterprise gets what they want, which is aligned non-dilutive capital that actually rewards them for the social impact that they create. So think about a little bit like a carbon market for social outcomes, is that finally you actually have a way of getting paid for the good that you create rather than just the money that you make. And then the investor is able to invest alongside, recognizing in the full confidence that A, you have a public sector funder that believes in this enterprise, but B, you're also able to capture the commercial return for yourself while being supported by high quality verification and outcomes payment. So basically in this, everybody wins. Next slide, please. Sync is one model of impact-linked finance, and it happens to be where we started with high-growth social entrepreneurs. But there's one really, really important part of this, which is it's very, very demanding and has very high transaction costs because of the importance of verification. In many of these areas, we simply don't know what good looks like. We don't know whether a social enterprise is being over-optimistic or overly conservative in terms of thinking about the number of low-income customers they can serve. We don't necessarily know what the cost to serve will be, and we don't know what the quality of the service will be. So all of those things are incredibly important to understand so that we can set the right sort of impact pricing for the future and the appropriate contribution. Because typically in a development project or for a grant, you often report on outputs. You report on, say, the number of farmers that a social enterprise reaches or the number of students who attend a course. But to be honest, that doesn't really matter. What matters is the quality and the outcome, not necessarily the quantity or the output. So what we make sure to understand in our verification is what was the actual impact on these farmers? If they went through something, they got a new technology or a new way of approaching growing their crops, did it actually result in better income for them? If we're looking at education, was the quality of that education so good that it actually helped income later on? These are the sorts of questions that development actors and funders should have been asking for many years, but often haven't. And the fact that we're asking them and getting answers will allow us to have a much better set of impact pricing in the future, which is actually pretty exciting. Next slide, please. So I think there's one more slide.
I think that is the last slide.
Okay, in which case, then what I will just do, because I've given you a very quick tour here, is to say just 3 things in summary. The first is impact-linked finance is particularly appropriate for high-impact, high-ambition social enterprises that have a keen interest in becoming commercially viable in future. This isn't a grant. This isn't something for an NGO or a charity or anything like that. It's a stop along the way in order to get rewarded for social outcomes and prove that there's a path to commercial viability. The second thing to say is it works very well across sectors. What you do need, though, is an outcome payer. And part of the challenge that we see is there's only a tiny number of outcome payers that are prepared to work in this way because the transaction costs are very high and the effort required from the funder and from the enterprise is pretty high as well. And the third thing I'd say is that despite all the challenges and the fact that it's a very new market where we have to do a lot of advocacy and education, I believe it really is the way of the future. And don't take my word for it. This is where I'll hand over to Greg, an actual entrepreneur who's gone through this process. Thanks very much for the opportunity, Sebastian.
Fantastic, Ramona. No, and thank you so much for giving us this overview. I think it was incredibly useful. Maybe before we transition, we'd love to ask you a few questions. And if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free, to put them in the chat, and we'll definitely bring them up. We also have Ramona and Greg both together a Q&A towards the end. But maybe before we move on, Ramona, could you tell us a little bit more about how do entrepreneurs actually go in terms of kickstarting the process of obtaining this type of financing? Normally, who are they talking to first?
Great question. So at the moment, unfortunately, there isn't really anyone to approach because in the way that development organizations or foundations do this, they're either setting up a call for applications in a particular sector. For example, we've just launched a call for EdTech companies in West Africa, along with the foundation and outcomes payer. So it sort of depends on their particular agenda or priority for the time, and they really determine the timing of these things. Or what we're trying to do is encourage them more to set up ongoing funds. So because a call is time limited, it just might happen to be that an enterprise sees the advert for a call and applies, but we want to make sure that there are actually funds or facilities that are available ongoing in much the same way that a private venture fund would be available for ongoing investment and also for follow-on investment, because the other challenge with this is if you can only do a small amount at the outset, you miss the chance to actually support the enterprise in its growth.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and I think that makes a lot of sense too, because I think one of the main questions that we always hear from entrepreneurs is, how do I know if I qualify? How do I know if it's the right opportunity? I think these calls for applications or these structured funds make a lot of sense because entrepreneurs can go and very easily see what are the bases to participate. Fantastic. And we actually have a question regarding how many deals has Roots of Impact facilitated up to date?
So we've been around for about 6 years. And like I say, we're not just operating on our own behalf. We're also trying to train an entire sector and motivate an entire industry of kind of development finance to work differently. So we don't measure our own success only by the number of transactions or facilities that we have, but also by the sort of amount of capital that is being mobilized in this direction. We actually publish all of our findings on our website, and we've just finished the sort of impact report from our first 5 years. But basically, we've done about 70 of these. But because the time frame tends to be 2 to 5 years, depending, there's probably about 20 that have been kind of reported on in some fashion out in public. But I'm pleased to say the momentum is accelerating, and even though it's a tiny base, like I said, I think this is an approach that I would really love to see many, many more public and philanthropic funders take in the future.
Certainly, I echo that, and I think there is a fantastic opportunity here. And Ramona, maybe before we let you go, could you tell us a little bit more about how the actual impact metrics or impact terms for this structure agreed upon? Is
Sure.
it a conversation with the startup, or is it already normally set up by the outcome provider?
Yep. Oh, it's not one conversation, Sebastian. It is many conversations. So, like I said, the transaction cost, because this is such an early stage and because we are so ambitious in terms of wanting to build our knowledge base, and we're so rigorous in terms of our measurement, there's usually a couple of months of work for both the entrepreneur and Roots of Impact, as well as the outcomes funder, to come to an agreement about what good looks like. For example, if an enterprise is very early stage, we might actually, there's two critical elements of this, right? There's actually selecting the metrics, and then there's, in a way, the boundaries of performance. So the metrics they need to be things, as I said, that are not about outputs, but outcomes. So, for example, not number of farmers reached, but actual increase of farmer income. But they can also be qualitative indicators. For example, an indicator of the improvement of subjective reported well-being, which we feel often get very much overlooked in an excessively financial or quantitative environment. So we agree the metrics first, and then we agree the boundaries of performance. For some later stage enterprises, we may be so tough on them that they actually may get very little money as outcomes payments, but what they will get is a rigorous research base. We feel it's fairer that way. If an enterprise is taking a greater risk at the early stage of its journey, we support them more than if the enterprise has already raised quite a lot of capital but wants to understand its outcomes. So at the moment, it's a highly artisanal and very iterative process between the parties involved.
Makes sense. No, and I think that's part of scaling this instrument. I think that's also part of what makes it so exciting, right? It's, each transaction is kind of setting precedents. So it's a great time, I think, to start. And then to finalize,
I spotted one other question just that I wanted to address in terms of measuring impact and it being fragmented. And Sebastian, that's a really good question. Just so you're aware, we're also starting on technology, a technology partnership that will help us really scale the availability of impact data in this area. It's not just self-reported by the enterprise, but also in certain sectors where possible, we have things like Internet of Things data or satellite data that help to give us benchmarks. For those of you who know 60 decibels, I mean, they've done a great job in starting to develop benchmarks around off-grid energy in East Africa or fintech. So wherever possible, we're actually really, really keen to make this not as artisanal, but much, much more standardized. So I just wanted to address that question.
No, thank you so much. I think that's an incredibly useful comment, and I agree. I think it's interesting because we're kind of seeing all these different benchmarks and all these different tools to really measure impact. It's fantastic to know that the Roots of Impact is also working on that because I do think it is. I think part of scaling this and making it easy to to bring to the masses or to a large number of startups is kind of standardizing these processes, right?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right, perfect, Ramona. Well, thank you very much for your insights. I think they've been incredibly helpful. We're going to have you back at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll definitely address them in the Q&A part of the webinar. In the meantime, we're going to jump to the next speaker. Now I would like to invite Greg to the stage. Hey, Greg, how are you doing?
Excellent. Good morning, everyone.
Awesome. Everyone, Greg is a three-time social entrepreneur with over 14 years of experience creating access to quality healthcare to the underserved in Latin America. He's a graduate of the Global MBA at Tulane and University of Chile. Greg, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Please tell us a little bit more about you, about what you're building at Nobleus and your journey.
Thanks, Sebas, and thank you, Ramona, for that amazing explanation of the amazing work that Roots of Impact is doing in this space. And Sebas, after sitting here for about 20 minutes looking at your background, I'm starting to wonder if you have all of the paperwork necessary for
I
those
do.
archaeological remains.
Of course, of course.
Good. Here we are talking about impact. I want to make sure that we're all
Of course. No, it's only fair.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, I could share my screen here and we could jump right into this.
Yeah, please do.
Definitely.
We'd love to learn about, what are you doing in Nobleus and exactly how was your experience accessing impacting financing?
Brilliant. Yeah. So Nobleus is a social enterprise, a high impact social enterprise that I founded with co-founder Paul Quinones almost 8 years ago now. And we have been mobilizing access to high quality dental care to underserved communities here in Ecuador, in the highlands of Ecuador mainly, where I've been living and working. And as you can see in this photo, this is actually an image of one of our mobile clinics. So we have a network of clinics, and 3 out of 4 people in Latin America lack access to quality dental services. So we mobilize access to people who live specifically in rural areas where access is limited. Here's an image of a actual patient of ours, a woman who told me that the first and last time that she had been to the dentist, she was 5 years old. So this is indicative of the kind of problem that we're trying to solve, which is more than just geographic and access and financial, but also it's a cultural one of experience. This particular woman had such a traumatic experience going to the dentist when she was 5 that she never wanted to return. So we have this really innovative model where we provide preventative and integrative care at the workplace, community, or even home care, actually, in this case now. And we provide educational workshops. We partner with the employer. Typically, these are employers who employ low income, blue collar workers who earn the minimum wage here in Ecuador of $400 a month, work in a factory or farm, and probably haven't been in the dentist in about 4 years on average. So the employer subsidizes the cost of preventative care, and then we provide access to up to 6 months financing through the worker's payroll. And then we also work with different bilaterals and organizations to receive impact-linked financing and grants. So, we have a network of mobile, portable, and stationary clinics. Here are some images actually during COVID of providing high quality dental care for a fraction of the cost. So these are some images taken recently. This is portable dentistry. So portable is anything that can be carried by an individual. These are portable chairs. This is on the coast of Ecuador during September of last year, in the midst of some of the worst months of the pandemic. We were still out there. Our team was out there providing care. This is an image of a dental clinic that we built 3 years ago on the inside of the Quito airport. So we reach workers there at the airport. And then this is actually just the biosecurity measures of what we've had to do to remain safe during the pandemic. And just to give you a little snapshot, because I do want to talk about how the importance of having really a high impact business model and thesis is the key to receiving impact linked finance. And here's kind of a brief overview. Once our patient is up to about 5 visits, they've had a complete paradigm shift and are with a whole new oral health lease on life, and receiving orthodontics and other specialty care. So we've reached over 20,000 patients, 80% of whom are classified as underserved or low income. And just historically, what has our path been for this impact linked financing? Well, in 2018, we actually received a technical cooperation grant from the IDB of $150,000. This is all available online at the IDB Labs website. And then that technical cooperation grant ended 2 years later. And then actually we ended up receiving the Sync Fund, which also was then financed by the IDB. And well, how did we get there? And this is one of the things that people are always asking: how do you get access to these types of financing mechanisms? And I certainly was asking the same question just a few years ago, so I can understand. And well, we were accepted into this really wonderful accelerator for social impact enterprises in Latin America. It's called I3 LATAM. And we were a part of the 2017-2018 cohort. This is actually a photo of us taken at like 3 a.m. After partying and dancing all night in Mexico at the FLEA conference, which is Impact Investing Forum hosted every year in Merida, Mexico. And these are the 10 organizations from that year, some really high impact organizations. And essentially, going through that accelerator, we ended up meeting in FLEA Rory from Roots of Impact, who is the person behind the Sync Fund that Ramona was talking about a moment ago. And when I spoke at FLEA and we met Rory, and he was there looking for different organizations that could be eligible for the Sync Fund, I knew that we were still a little too early on. So I didn't apply. I waited about a year and a half, and then actually sent in a really well thought out application. I think it probably was like a 20-page document that we put together, showing our scale model and our impact thesis, and demonstrating already the documentation and audits that we've received for the impact that we measure very actively in the organization around health metrics specifically. And then we actually received approval for the Sync Fund, which in this case is a $280,000 over 6 semesters with different disbursements based off of 3 different impact or social outcome based measures. And here's actually the document that we signed on the 13th of March last year, right when we went into quarantine, as you guys will all remember. And Ecuador was one of the hardest hit places in the world, actually. So we had a 2 p.m. curfew for many months, and we received this money, or the first payment from the Sync Fund right at the very beginning of this, which was critical for us to be able to survive and then thrive actually during the pandemic. And so, like Ramona was saying, each deal is different. Each deal is based off of the organization's current kind of situation, and then also their plan for scale. So in this case, we put together 3 different impact measures. The first is patient satisfaction, and that's just looking at our underserved patients. And then the second is the percentage of underserved patients. And right, this is an output in this case, but of course, Roots of Impact already had analyzed the impact that we're creating, the health impact. So really their goal was to understand then, well, how many patients are underserved that we're reaching. And right now it's actually at the 72% top threshold. So if we're at 72% or above of our patient base in this upcoming semester, then we'll receive the full disbursement. And then the last one was the percentage of children treated. And I hate to say it, but because of COVID, with these mobile clinics at the work site, usually we would have parties on the weekends to provide dental care to family members, but that has been severely affected, and they haven't been able to reach a significant number of children for the vaccine yet. So that metric has been eliminated for the time being. And what's wonderful about the way that this is structured is how flexible it is. And then the counterpart here for us beyond the impact performance is that we had to raise $1 million of capital or debt, so investment capital or debt. And we have, because of this, actually attracted one of the most important and I would say most ethically aligned healthcare holding in the country called Medisystem Holding, and it was kind of an amazing journey to have in the middle of the pandemic to receive the sync fund and then go negotiate a deal with this group. And then just to give you an idea of the structural overview of this model that Ramona was just talking about, there's Nobleus in the middle is the social impact enterprise. And then in this case, the IDB lab is the financier of the outcome payments. And then, there's the percentage of vulnerable patients as an example of the metrics that they're looking at. And then the verifier is roots of impact in this case. So here you could see actually a real world example of what this looks like. And as a result of this fund, we were able to purchase and invest in new equipment and biosecurity safety that allowed us to immediately pivot and continue to provide care. One of the only organizations in all of Ecuador, dental organizations, that was still open. And then here's an image of what it looked like negotiating terms. We had actually presented a valuation with projections in the middle of the pandemic, even though we were hemorrhaging cash. And this, holding really was gracious and loved the idea that we had this impact linked financing mechanism. It was actually one of the things that piqued their interest and made them understand just kind of the different type of vision that we had. And they invested specifically because of our social impact. So here we are with the president of that holding, Juan Sevilla, in front of a new clinic that we built. This is actually the first solidarity clinic. So we've opened a high-end solidarity clinic that reaches upper income patients, but this allows us to cross-subsidize the rest of our model. And actually in the last 4 months, I could say that it's been going really well. And this clinic is now profitable, and it is helping the other social clinics that we operate, which are typically operating at a loss, to be more sustainable. So these are some images of this new clinic that we've opened here in Quito. And I don't know if you want to jump into some questions here, if I should leave the presentation open.
For sure. No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, Greg. It's great to see not only the whole story of Nobleus and really the impact that you're all having, but how you really tie that into the mechanism. And I really appreciated the breakdown. I think it gives an important context for people in the audience. We'll be accepting questions. So if there's any questions, please do type them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm just wondering, could you tell us a little bit, about why you chose this type of structure specifically, and what other types of instruments you considered when raising capital?
Yeah, so we were looking for this type of mechanism when we, started the organization. We're kind of one of the few public health impact enterprises in Latin America that actually is providing the access or the medical service. And we had early on been looking at the bilateral, organizations and the development banks, and just kind of had our eyes open. And when we saw this sync fund, actually the first sync fund that was distributed was to another medical organization in Mexico. And they provide access to medical services for people with diabetes. It's called Clínicas de Azúcar. And when we saw that and we learned about, what they had done in that specific deal and how that, network of clinics was scaling so rapidly in Mexico, we were very interested. We're just always, studying and researching. I'm actually going to be hiring a grant writer next year who will also be looking for these types of instruments that obviously are different from a traditional grant. And we really want to engage in these types of opportunities because they are so innovative, and implicitly they bring so much interest, and they llama la atención. They call attention.
Love that. Yeah, and I think your ability to actually raise capital, raise an investment after this is definitely a testament to that. we have a few questions from the audience around actually measuring your impact. So could you please tell us a little bit more about, how these specific KPIs were, negotiated, and most importantly, what were your learnings on measuring impact, since it's obviously a key part of this type of instrument?
Yeah, so as a health organization, we're measuring many different variables around oral health disease and incidence. Things that you'd imagine, like number of cavities before and after our interventions, percentage of patients with gingivitis or periodontal disease, patients that need extractions, patients that need prosthetics, etc. So Roots of Impacts obviously looked at that information, looked at that data that we have in our database, and they said, okay, well, we understand that the care that you're providing, the model that you have, is generating a high level of impact. We work with different universities in the U.S. and Ecuador that have also looked at our data and have used it actually for studies. So in that sense, they kind of had that check that they needed to validate our impact. And then they said, well, what's relevant in terms of generating more impact that we can easily measure? And this is one of the things that I think is phenomenal about what Roots of Impact is doing, because a lot of other grant organizations that provide technical cooperation, often, the administrative cost of administering the grant is maybe just as high as the amount of money that they're injecting into the organization, which is kind of an old paradigm that in many ways, this new wave is trying to change. So really, when we put this together, it was a back and forth. It was a very collaborative process. We co-created these measures with the folks at Roots of Impact, and they wanted to make sure, in the case of percentage of vulnerable patients, that was like the key feature. And then what's a quick way to understand if those patients are receiving the level of customer service that they want, or if they feel that the care is at the level of quality, and is dignified to their desires and needs. So that's where the patient satisfaction came in. And again, they wanted it to be very easy to measure. So we do surveys with our patients on an ongoing basis that look at a number of different metrics around satisfaction. But they wanted to take kind of the overall patient satisfaction just to make it very easy to report on. But they do look at other data that we send them. So the KPIs that I shared are a summary of what they look at, but it's also based off of other things that they're analyzing. Like we even talked about a gender component on the mix of patients that we have, and a goal that we have to increase the number of female patients. Right now, we have a little bit more women than men as patients, and we want to continue that because they're high impact patients. They're the type of people who empower other people in their communities to go to the dentist and to be healthy. So yeah, it was a co-creation.
Awesome. Perfect. And in terms of perhaps, actually applying the process to measure and gather this data, was this process something that normally you get assistance with, or is that something you already had in place? How did that change once you got the capital?
Regarding how we measure our
the actual
data?
Execution of the measurements.
Yeah, so we've from day one, and this is one of those recommendations that I always give to social entrepreneurs or any entrepreneur really, is that you should be measuring and collecting big data in whatever it is that you're doing from day one. We actually didn't have an immediate plug and play software system for electronic medical records in Latin America for data around public health for dentistry. So that didn't exist. So of course, we had to work with programmers to build our first system that we used at the very beginning. And while that was being built, we were using Excel spreadsheets to collect that data, which is of course the easiest MVP for any organization. So we went from Excel spreadsheets in those early days in 2016 to then later this system that we launched. And that system ended up not being streamlined enough, and there were some issues around accessing the data in an easy way and having dashboards. So then we found another organization out of Chile, actually, that has its own plug and play electronic medical record system for dentistry. But then we have worked with them to program in looking at different measures and being able to, graphically show to our clients at the end of every, on-site clinical operation that we have, what's the before and after. So
That's
say
awesome.
we've had patients that are on their third visit,
Yeah.
they get their own data. If you're on your third visit, what's your before and after visit 1, after visit 2, after visit 3, if you're on your first visit. So the idea is to be able to measure and compare. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I love that it's. I think you make a great point, which I think a lot of times overlooked. Where this data is not just to report on your impact metrics, or to satisfy the requirements of the capital, but really it's something that you can use in your business, to provide more information to your customers or improve their experience. So that's super super interesting. Fantastic. Greg, thank you very much for your insights. I would love to give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions as well. So if you haven't, please drop them in the chat. And I'll invite back Ramona into the stage if you can please rejoin us, so we can start a Q&A session. The idea here, hey Ramon, nice to have you back. The idea here is to have an open discussion, or entrepreneurs in the audience can certainly ask any questions. And maybe to kick things off, I think we talked a little bit about all these different steps, but maybe Ramona, since you've worked so many of these processes, normally how long do these take?
So the amount of time that it takes can be measured in a couple of different ways. I mean, once we actually have a fund or facility or a competition set up, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's a couple of months of back and forth, an agreement, and then off we go. And like I said, the term of the agreement is often 2 to 3 years, because you want to make sure to give enough time, especially to an early stage social enterprise, to achieve outcomes and also to achieve some learning. But unfortunately, a lot of the time it takes is actually the setup with the public body or foundation. We've been in conversations with some groups for years because they feel no particular urgency to act, or they may be limited by their own bureaucratic processes in terms of budget allocations. COVID didn't necessarily help this, because of course a lot of people went into a scramble mode where they either allocated funds very much needed to COVID emergency relief, but that derailed all the business as usual stuff or pushed it forward. Or it served as an excuse, maybe a little bit less favorably, to start to do anything new. So I would say that, once the funds are allocated, once the objective is clear, it doesn't take actually all that long. All the time is in the funders' deliberations and cogitation beforehand.
I can see that, and that's why we need organizations like Roots of Impact to really lead the charge, right? I would be curious, maybe, one of the interesting things, Greg, you mentioned was, you really leveraged this this capital to obtain an investment, and it seems from what you mentioned, it was also one of the covenants to raise outside capital. Is that something that is commonly seen on the field? And maybe, Greg, you can tell us a little bit about how it was your experience fundraising and how this type of capital opened doors.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and in our particular case, this was a key feature to be able to open up the doors, actually, for us to sit down with this holding. And it was during the middle of the pandemic, which makes it even stranger, really. But basically, we had a meeting to talk about a corporate alliance with one of the companies in the holding, and we were able to have the president of the holding show up to the meeting. And the folks at that company in the holding had wondered why the boss of their boss was present in the meeting, and it was because we wanted to do more than just a corporate alliance. And actually, in one slide, we mentioned that we were receiving this really innovative impact-linked financing mechanism called SYNC with the Swiss Development Agency and the IDB and Roots of Impact. And just by mentioning that one bullet point on a slide of a presentation of an hour, we didn't talk about raising money other than that one point. He said that we had to raise $1 million over the next couple of years, and that we had these social impact outcomes that were being measured. And just with that, at the end of the meeting, the president of the holding wrote to one of our partners and said, "How can we invest in Nobleus?" So I definitely can say definitively that the Sync Fund was truly kind of the tip of the spear for us to be able to, target the organization we were interested in, and then plant that seed. And immediately then we were sitting down with the board of the holding, and they were very interested in our social impact model. And because the fund, and mechanism is focused on social impact, there never was any discussion about what it is we were doing or where we were headed, what our vision was. It was very clear from the get-go. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a beautiful concept that I hope proliferates even further. How many deals, how many Sync deals have gone through to date, Ramona?
Well, like I said, it's about 70, at various stages, but only about 20 that are really kind of out in public. Because again, a lot of it is about trying to convince more funds to come in, more than just a deal by deal basis, trying to get the funding for 20 or 30 at a time, for example, which is where you start to see efficiencies, economies of scale, the building of benchmarks, all of that. So yeah, low number, high growth rate. Sound familiar?
Amazing. No, I think that's a high number, because Sync is only 5-6 years old. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably one of the most innovative financing mechanisms in the world. And we're really excited to be a part of this new wave of capital being, redistributed differently and changing the destination of investment capital globally.
I just wanted to add something, Sebastian, if I may, to Greg's point,
Of course.
which is, I think some people say, well, isn't it a restriction or a difficulty to ask the enterprise to raise capital alongside a Sync? In our view, it's a must-have, because you have to prove that this enterprise is investable, as well as proving the enterprise is high impact. If the enterprise were only high impact, then it would be a candidate for traditional grant capital, but it would have a very difficult path to scale. In a way, we believe in these enterprises so much that we require that there be and it doesn't have to be equity capital, it can be debt, it can be whatever, but it needs to be a classical investment raise alongside this very new form of what is, at its heart, it's actually grant capital. It's just being used in a very, very different way.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that's critical, especially in that financing gap, where we found ourselves, to be able to come in and top off the revenue, so that, really maybe a year where we're burning quite a bit of capital still, and we're on a pathway towards profitability, maybe years out. For a lot of traditional investors, or different investment groups here in Latin America, for example, they're not comfortable often with investing in a company that's still burning or has a high burn rate. So really, it's one of those tools that has a huge multiplier effect or ratio for the investment that can be raised. And hopefully, we can become one of the first organizations to receive a second Sync fund when we go raise, $10 million in an upcoming round, where that concessionary capital can also serve a similar purpose to attract, a group of investors, or impact VCs that also might need a little bit of incentive to help us continue to grow and scale.
Certainly. No, and I think this point of it's not just the actual amount of dollars you get, but also how it really is this catalytic form of financing. I think it's incredibly important and also incredibly powerful. Ramona, you were mentioning a little bit, about all these processes and the number of deals, and I'm curious, having seen all these deals, what are some common barriers or mistakes entrepreneurs do when trying to access this type of capital that might make them ineligible for it?
Yep. Well, there's a few tips I would have. Let's just say this is not a solution for everyone. I mean, this is something that works under very specific circumstances. First of all, you need to be in an ODA eligible market. So, for example, someone in Germany, I know that there are some similar things like this, but nothing to this scale. There needs to be basically a market failure. and a very, very large need that can be met for basic services that can be met, or a need for transition, for example, climate or climate smart transition, or serving low-income populations. There has to be a big enough opportunity to go for. Secondly, I'd say there has to be a big enough innovation. There has to be an innovation in the business model or in the product or service that allows for scale, because what we often see is a lot of classical social enterprises that operate at a very local level doing excellent work but have no potential for scalability, and they can't understand why they're not good candidates for sync. But coming back to the scalability and the investability and the ambition of the enterprise, that's part of the reason why. And third, there has to be a willingness, and not everyone is willing to do this, to be extremely rigorous and open about impact measurement, because it's tough to do. It requires an investment of time, management, energy. Not to say it's not worth doing. And Greg, I'm glad that you pointed out this is business critical information. It's not just information the funders are asking for. It's actually used to steer the business. But a lot of innovators find this kind of thing very boring, and they don't actually want to invest the time or the money to set up these systems. I would actually say that's probably the most valuable thing that we do at the end of the day, is actually that kind of rigor. And it's the thing that most scale-oriented impact enterprises value the most. But it's by no means common practice among every social enterprise that we've seen.
Oh, for sure. And I think, I don't know, Greg, if you were going to comment, but yeah, I think this part of data measurement, I think, is critical, and something that we as investors, coming from seed stars, more traditional venture capital equity investor, we love seeing this data. And for us, it's incredibly important to work with entrepreneurs that really understand their business. And I think this part of really setting this measurements is key, not only for business success, but also in future fundraisings.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember even looking at the P&Ls around the money that we were investing early on in building these systems, and improving upon systems that we had already built, and how difficult that was for us. But knowing that those were investments that were critical to be able to, attract sync or to attract other investors, and to be able to communicate, to our stakeholders, our clients, our users, what the impact of our work is, to justify, obviously, their investment in, preventative care of their workers, or the workers themselves investing in their own care. So these are things that we also, present when we give educational workshops. We show them the data from, their work site. So it's critical for all the different stakeholders involved. Always be measuring.
Love it. ABM.
Yeah. Forget about ABC. That's so 1980s.
I love that. And maybe as a follow-up to this question, I think, should entrepreneurs already have, all these systems in place, or is that something that they can expect, once they access this type of financing, where they'll get a little bit more help? And maybe as an expansion to that question is, beyond measuring, what other types of maybe non-capital or technical assistance can entrepreneurs expect from these types of financing?
Yep. I mean, I think Greg actually alluded to the fact that there had been a prior grant in place. And I think looking for a grant to help with impact measurement setup is probably one of the best things any enterprise can do to help its future fundraising potential. So there's also all kinds of technical assistance available. Often technical assistance is a lot easier to come by than cash. But what I have personally seen is there's a great range of value in technical assistance programs, some of which I honestly think they'd be better off just handing the cash directly to the entrepreneur and have done with it. But others where there's genuine value in things like investment readiness, in things like impact measurement. Those tend to be the areas where entrepreneurs actually really need this support, or even things that are slightly more esoteric, like helping to influence regulation and policy environments, where a lot of the gap to scaling is actually around a policy failure or a market failure that is being driven by incumbents. I've seen a lot of that in renewable energy or mobile or digital finance, for example.
Awesome. No, that makes tons of sense. And I think this type of, it's not just whether you access one of these instruments. I think that's something we've been trying to really drill down through this series is a suite of products, and you can mix and match them depending on your situation. So yeah, I think, this type of, let's get some grants, set in place, and this enables you to get the next instrument. I think that's fantastic. We have a few more minutes for questions. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, please do feel free to drop them. But maybe, Greg, I would love to ask you, as someone who's already been through this process, is thinking about, maybe tapping into more impact link financing. What are some learnings that you take from, your first go at it that will change how you do things the next time you apply for this type of funding?
I think one of the biggest lessons that I would want to share is that you should be years ahead of making the ask, years ahead of applying for the fund. And that's kind of fortunately the way that we've gone about it from early on. So typically we'll look at different opportunities, even like the accelerator from 2017 and 2018. The year before it, we had applied to it and weren't accepted because we were still such a small organization, didn't have a lot of validation. And then in the second year, we were able to get in that accelerator program. And it's kind of the same thing for these types of deals and opportunities, is that, you should be really, prospecting in advance and looking at your strategic plan and figuring out which strategic partners could be, ideal for year 2 or year 3, and start to prospect those contacts and start to research who's in the organization, go on LinkedIn, maybe reach out, see if you can set up a call just to ask questions, and in that process, I think, build those relationships that then later will be critical when you make an application, right? Because otherwise they're just receiving one of hundreds or thousands of applications. And I think that having that personal contact and really building a map of prospects is key. So we're going to be raising money in 2 years, and we want to raise a Series A that for a high impact public health organization in Latin America has really never been seen before. So we're already out on the ground, going to conferences, and not asking for money. I don't think that's really the way to go about it. You should be building the contacts, asking questions, and prospecting just way ahead of the curve. And obviously there's, a luxury for an entrepreneur to be able to do that and to not be in the day-to-day of operations, which for the first time in 6.5, 7 years of operations, I finally am no longer involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, which is key for prospecting these types of opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it. And maybe quickly before we wrap up, Ramona, I'm just curious, you mentioned you think of this type of instrument as a future. So can you tell us what excites you the most about this field and what's changing? I don't know if we lost you or you can still hear us.
I can still hear you now.
Perfect. Yeah. So just very quickly, I was asking, you mentioned impact link financing. You see it as a future. I'm just curious, quickly, one or two things or developments in the field that excite you the most, that will unlock for entrepreneurs.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that I think other parties are coming to us now and saying, help us understand how to run these programs. We now only run about 40% of our own programs. A lot of it is now done through third parties, partners, and others. I also think there are other funders, other foundations, other public funders who are starting to take the lead from some of the early pioneers like IDB Lab or SDC and starting to get this. The one thing that we have to prove to everyone is this concept of additionality, which is why should public funds go to private enterprises? And I think there's still a huge amount of resistance and reluctance, a lot of which is just ideological. It actually doesn't make any sense. But I'm encouraged by the fact that I think now people recognize that enterprises like Greg's are really the only way and the best way, in the absence of coherence of the state and its ability to provide essential services, that a lot of low-income populations are going to be served. We need all the innovation, all the energy, and all the entrepreneurship that we can get, and we have to figure out how to fund it. And dollar for dollar, it's a much better investment, as you all at SeedStars know, than most other things. So I'm quietly encouraged.
Love that, and thank you for much so much for those comments. With that last question, we actually conclude our Q&A section with our speakers. Or before we say goodbye, I just wanted to quickly showcase a few potential investors or ecosystem players that might be useful if you're as an entrepreneur, if you're thinking about accessing impact link financing. We've put a few names out here, but of course, there's tons of other players. Like Ramona said, this is a very rapidly changing ecosystem. So definitely do your research, talk to as many people like Greg mentioned as possible, and get yourself out there to access this type of financing. Thank you very much, Ramona. Thank you very much, Greg. Really appreciate your time. And maybe to finalize, I just want to thank everyone in the audience for being part of our um, yeah, of our 7.1 series of non-dilutive capital. All of this information is available on our YouTube channel as well as our website. We've had really a fantastic time talking to experts across all these type of instruments, and we hope the sessions have been very helpful. Greg, Ramona, thank you so much for your time. Your insights were tremendously helpful, and I'm sure that entrepreneurs will in the audience will make good use of them.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sebas. Thank you,